Okay, so moving on. We are now at the psychiatry chapter, which isn't really that bad at all. And it's nice because, coming from cardiovascular onwards, like there's quite a roller coaster of difficulty levels. You have the super difficult cardiovascular, then you have the slightly complicated but easy endocrine, very easy GIT. Then you have a dense chapter of heme onc because there's a lot of stuff happening with the oncology aspect. But again, not so bad. It is all memorizable. It just takes some time. Musculoskeletal is just very long because there's not much in first aid itself, but you have to gather information from all over the place to get it all down better. Mostly U-world, right? The innervation and all that from your nerves and the anatomy of all your muscles and stuff like that. Neuro, again, is pretty much even bigger than cardiovascular. And now we're at a very easy chapter called psychiatry. It's not that bad at all. There's a lot to know here, of course, but majority of it is just going to be vocab, a lot of vocabulary, right? So the first chapter here of psychiatry is your psychology section, which is mainly just all vocabulary. So this is mainly just all going to be like literally the main explanation of why people act the way they do, what influences them to behave the way they do, and what it means, right? There's going to be the whole concept of conditioning here, and then the rest of it is all about the various ego defenses that we're all carrying out at different times, and oftentimes we don't even know we're doing it. Vanessa is asking, excuse me, Vanessa is asking how long did it take you to prepare for your step one? I prepared for step one for 6 months. Yeah, the first 3 months were really like slow, and then the last 3 months were just really intense. I was home and not working the whole time. I didn't have class either, so that played a big role in that. And then once I finished step one, then I did my rotations. Nina Alexander said, "Can't keep a good man down. Was sick a few days ago, but refuses to let the people down." Yeah. I've been ridiculously sick. It took forever for it to go away, but I basically fixed up without really, taking any antibiotics or anything because it was viral. It just took a very long time for it to all go away. And even now I have like very residual coughs left, but not so bad. But yes, thank you very much. So it's good to be back on track. Let's keep going, kick ass, finish this up, and get into renal really quickly because that's a lot more medical and very, very important high yield stuff there. So the first topic here is about conditioning, right? They talk about classical conditioning versus operant conditioning, and these are things that you've all encountered in your practice questions or in day-to-day life. Classical conditioning is learning in which a natural response, such as salivation, is elicited by a conditioned or learned stimulus like a bell that previously was presented in conjunction with an unconditioned stimulus like food. Now, we all have forms of classical conditioning in all of us. In my house, for example, when I was preparing for step one and I was living at home, every time my mom was about to get up to cook, she would turn on the TV. So when the TV would turn on, I would feel like, okay, good food's about to start coming, and I could tell, like, I'm getting really eager for food. My stomach would start grumbling. I would start feeling this, sense of extreme hunger, even though I might not actually be that hungry per se. Like, I'll be just fine. I don't feel so hungry. Then I hear the TV turn on downstairs, and I'm like, oh, food's about to start getting cooked, and I would get hungry. So that kind of classical conditioning stuff just happens. It just happens. Our brain naturally associates things to each other. And, there's no association per se of cause and effect. It's just the two things happen at the same time, so you start associating with the third thing. So in this example they gave here, the natural response was salivation to food, right? The food was your unconditioned stimulus. Your conditioned stimulus was the extra thing that happened that just so happened to be related to the food, and that was the bell, right? So now you end up having this conditioned response, and conditioned is just like, hair conditioner or conditioning anything in general. It's pretty fake in the sense that it's not like a real thing, right? So when you have a conditioned response, it's pretty much like a fake response. You're salivating to the bell, which is not a real thing, right? No one should really be salivating per se just because they heard a bell. You're supposed to salivate when you have really delicious food in front of you or really good desserts in front of you. So always remember this kind of simple breakdown, because you can get questions about this kind of example, classical conditioning examples, and then they'll ask you, in this example, what is the unconditioned stimulus, what is the conditioned response, etc., etc. All your natural or unconditioned things are the things you understand. So the natural response is salivation, the unconditioned thing is actually food. The conditioned things are the extra stuff that aren't actually naturally related to each other, right? So the bell and salivation are not actually related to each other. The conditioned response is the same as the natural response, but they respond to different things. Also remember that. So this usually deals with involuntary responses, right? And that makes sense. Salivation is not something you per se activate, or whatever. You don't think, okay, brain, make me salivate, and then you do it. It just naturally happens. And that's why it's an involuntary response. Pavlov's classical experiment with dogs, ringing the bell provoked salivation. Okay, so classical conditioning, very common thing, very simple thing to understand, not too bad. Now with operant conditioning, I remember in the beginning, a lot of times I would have some difficulty understanding what reinforcement, punishment, and extinction were about, especially when you combine it with words like positive reinforcement versus positive punishment. Right, so adding positive and negative into words like this can often make things a little more complicated. So let's make sure we don't retain that confusion after today, because you aren't really supposed to revisit any of these topics. So the psychology section of this chapter is one of the few things that you do not revisit. You do not need to study it again after you've done it one time, right? Because this book is huge, and there's a lot of things you already have to come back and revisit and revise and repeat. The psychology section is one of those that you do not. Excuse me. Okay. So, operant conditioning, learning in which a particular action is elicited because it produces a punishment or reward, usually deals with voluntary responses, things that you actively decided to do. Okay? So then there's reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. Reinforcement is where you have a target behavior, like a response, is followed by the desired reward, a positive reinforcement, or removal of an aversive stimulus, negative reinforcement. So now, never really get confused by what it means to do positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. The concept is you're reinforcing something. So basically, whatever that voluntary response was, you liked it. So you reinforce it. There's two ways to reinforce it. Either one, you give a reward, so that it's positive reinforcement. It's called positive because something is being added in, right? So you gave a reward. Maybe, so I wrote here, so you reward the person to continue the good behavior, or you remove a bad consequence to continue the good behavior. Negative reinforcement is not a punishment, which is a very common mistake or misunderstanding a lot of people had in the beginning when they first start studying this. So let's come up with an example then, right? So let's say you have a child, and when he wakes up, he makes his bed, right? So this is something you were teaching your child. Now that target behavior of making his bed was a good thing. So when you saw it, you can either do positive reinforcement, where you maybe gave the kid candy today, right? And candy is a very controlled substance in your childhood, right? It's a controlled substance. Your parents give it to you a very timed manner and very limited amounts. So it's a good reward, and the kid's going to be happy, and it's going to keep the kid making his bed constantly. The other aspect of it is negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement means that you're still reinforcing the habit. You liked it. You like the fact that your kid made his bed, so you're going to reinforce that. And by calling it negative reinforcement, it basically means that you're taking something away, and that's going to help him feel like, all right, I'm going to keep doing this. So whatever you took away was still, in a sense, a reward. So negative reinforcement can be something like, all right, man, I saw that you made your bed today, so you don't have to do the dishes. Okay? So it's called negative reinforcement now because I took something away. I took away a chore he had, right? And he's happy about that. He's very happy about that. So that's going to reinforce him to continue making his bed or continue doing things that will make me happy like that, so that I can do more negative reinforcement. That's the concept of reinforcement right there. Now in punishment, you have a similar kind of thing. punishment, repeated application of an aversive stimulus, such as positive punishment, or removal of a desired reward, negative punishment, to extinguish unwanted behavior. This happens with us all the time, even in adulthood. So in adulthood, the most common positive punishment are tickets you get when you make mistakes in parking or driving. Say you're speeding, right? A cop will pull you over and give you a ticket for almost $150 or more or less, depending on where you are and how fast you were going. That is a positive punishment, right? That's positive because he gave you something. He gave you something, which is the ticket itself. Negative punishment is where you take away something that was supposed to be a reward, right? So at the same time, for example, being given a driver's license and having the right to drive in America is a privilege. Now, if you keep accruing more and more speeding tickets, then your driver's license can be taken away. That driver's license was actually your reward for being a good driver and passing your driver's test and all that. That driver's license being revoked from you now is your negative punishment. Either way, both of these are punishments, positive or negative. They're both punishments. They make you unhappy, and they aim to prevent you from doing the bullshit that you did that got you punished in the first place. Positive punishment means gaining something. Negative punishment means losing something. Right? So positive and negative, when you come into psychiatry, positive and negative always means gaining or losing something. When you do schizophrenia, for example, right? In schizophrenia, you're also going to have positive symptoms, which means you gained something, like maybe you have hallucinations now, and you didn't have that before. Maybe you just, have you're hearing voices, right? That's something you didn't have before. So those are gaining new characteristics. Whereas a negative symptom of schizophrenia would be something like a flattened affect. You don't display emotion anymore. But you had emotion before. Now you lost it, right? So that's how those things are named in psychiatry. And that's all that's happening here. The last thing here is extinction. So when you discontinue the reinforcement, either positive or negative, eventually you end up eliminating the behavior. And this kind of sucks, right? So same example, my kid made his bed, I was very happy about it, so I gave him candy. That was the positive reinforcement. Excuse me. So now, once maybe, I do it the first time, I do it the second time, third time, and then I stop giving him the candy. And he's supposed to keep making his bed. But now maybe 2 or 3 weeks pass, and he's going to stop making his bed because that positive reinforcement, which was motivating him to continue making his bed every day, is gone. Right? Can occur in operant or classical conditioning, either one. Right? So even in the classical conditioning, remember that if you stop associating the bell with the food, right, and for a long time, all you do is just put the food there with no bell ringing ever, right, and a long time passes by, and now you one day ring the bell, it might not actually cause salivation at all because the bell is no longer associated with food. Food was just coming. So this table here just tells you more about the same kind of stuff with examples, and this table really isn't necessary per se, but it does do the breakdown of what I was saying. So adding a stimulus or removing a stimulus is what turns something to be negative or positive. Okay, and if you're increasing behavior, that's always reinforcement because you're reinforcing the behavior. If you're trying to decrease the behavior, that's always a punishment. Now, after that, there's a tiny topic here that is, I would say, pretty high yield because I've seen it pop up a lot, and it's always like an easy question, but test writers always assume that you're going to mess that up and get it wrong. The concept of transference versus counter-transference. So what is this? Transference, and I have pictures here to help you kind of see the concept, I guess. Transference is when you have a patient projecting feelings about formative or other important persons onto the physician. So you can see here your patient, right? So this is you basically. Your patient is looking at you and saying something like, "He's so tall, like my dad," right? So he's transferring ideas about his own father onto the patient. Okay, and this can occur in many weird ways in various questions, right? Something like, maybe it's a female doctor and a patient comes in, he's like, wow, you're like really rude, just like my ex, right? So that's also transference. It can be anything. You have the same bag just like my kid does, or you have the same choice in candy just like my wife does, something like that. Any of these comparisons, if the patient is the one that's doing it, that's called transference. Now, the way I remembered that, right, because these two words is very easy to tell yourself and convince yourself, yeah, I remember it now, I'll never forget. And then you see it in question and you blank out. Just remember, patients are always transferred, right? Patients are transferred to the ICU. Patients are transferred from one hospital to another if the hospital you're at doesn't have the correct equipment. So always remember that the patient is the one that does the transference, right? Patients are transferred to the ICU. Transfer the patient to the ICU, transfer the patient to another ward, etc., etc. So that's what I always told myself. So if it's the patient that's making the comparison, that's transference. Counter-transference is what the doctor does, right? And as a doctor, your job is always to counter whatever your patient is telling you, right? And you're not really necessarily countering it, but you do respond to what your patient says, right? So that's the little association I made there. So counter-transference is the same thing, but now the doctor is doing it. So the doctor projects feelings about a formative or other important persons onto the patient. So you can see how, I don't know why they switched the people here, but the doctor is the one that's thinking now, and he's saying, gee, that's something my dad would say. Right? Maybe the patient said something like a weird word that not everyone really uses. I can't really think of something. So the main concept is whoever's thinking is the one that determines what word you use or what word you pick as an answer choice. Okay? And you always transfer patients, so patients are the ones that do the transference. Counter-transference is what you do as a doctor. Okay? And just be very careful before picking. There's always going to be extra stuff, extra bulky stuff in the question itself, so be careful in, picking out information that's actually relevant and stuff that's not. Now, the last thing here are your ego defenses. So ego defenses are broken down into immature ego defenses and then mature ego defenses. And there really isn't anything too confusing about that, but we're going to talk about all of these ego defenses, and we're going to see what it means or why it is that we call them immature, right? Because there's a lot of them that are immature. There's only 4 mature ways of apparently handling things. And the thing about immature ego defenses is that you have to remember, it's not the right thing to do. It's definitely not the right thing to do. One way to think about it is, would you be happy if your child was doing it? Or another way to think about it is, if when you were much younger, would your parents be happy if that's how you dealt with some issue? And then the cool thing, or the thing that people love about immature ego defenses, is that it makes them happy. It satisfies them. Even though it wasn't the right thing to do, it satisfies them, right? So for example, after a breakup, if someone goes and does something stupid like, I don't know, breaking the glasses of their ex's car or something like that, that's an immature ego defense, but it makes them happy, right? It's just not the right thing to do at all, though there's no logic to it, and it's definitely very wrong. So ego defenses that are immature are always going to be something like that. It's not something that you'd be proud of doing, but it makes them feel good. So the first one here, they talk about acting out, right? Very common thing. We've all seen it, and many of us have definitely done it. Let's read the top part first. The ego defenses, thoughts and behaviors, voluntary or involuntary, used to resolve conflict and prevent undesirable feelings of anxiety, depression, etc. So you just want to become happy. Acting out, subconsciously coping with stressors or emotional conflict using actions rather than reflections or feelings. Right? So a patient skips therapy appointments after deep discomfort from dealing with his past. Okay, that's a very simple and unreal example of acting out, but acting out is something that we all use on like everyday lingo, right? Everyone calls it, oh, why are you acting out? Acting out is basically you coping with a stressor in a way that really doesn't involve you sitting down and comfortably, just calmly thinking about it. Right? You're not calmly thinking about it. You're doing something stupid. So acting out can involve not going to work now because maybe you got a new bill and the bill was a lot bigger than you expected it to be. Okay, maybe you made an international phone call and your phone bill is supposed to be $110 and it was $300. So now you're gonna act out and get mad and get really stressed out about how you're gonna pay. And you're like, fuck this shit. I'm not even gonna go to work today. I'm just gonna sit in bed and cry. Right? Something silly like that. Very unreal, very immature. Denial is the avoiding the awareness of some painful reality, right? And this is again another thing we've all said. All of these are things that we've all kind of faced at some point, in at some level, either personally or seen someone else do it. So a patient with cancer plans a full-time work schedule despite being warned of significant fatigue during chemotherapy. Right? Being in denial is a very big thing, and it's very immature. You're basically denying the fact that something is true or something is problematic and acting as if it's not a thing. Right? So what would be another example of denial? Like avoiding the awareness of some painful reality. So for example, someone that knows they're not funny but wants to become a comedian, right? And they keep doing it. If you've seen the new Joker movie, you saw the denial in action, right? Because he's not funny. He's not funny at all, and he wants to be a comedian in the movie, and he keeps chasing that dream. He's living in denial of the fact that he's not actually funny, right? So denial is exactly what the word means. You're not accepting a really big reality just because if you do accept it, you're going to be pretty sad about it. Displacement is one of those words that doesn't really exactly fit like acting out in denial do in terms of its definition. So you have to make sure that you truly understand what it means for something to be displacement. Displacement is the redirection of emotions or impulses to a neutral person or object, something that is completely unrelated. So a teacher is yelled at by the principal, which is a normal thing to happen. Instead of confronting the principal directly, the teacher goes home and criticizes her husband's dinner selection. So in this example that they gave here, the husband is the neutral person, right? That husband had nothing to do with any of this. So this is something that everyone does. It's a very common thing. We're all guilty of it at some point. You're taking out one person's anger on someone else. That's displacement. So the way you make the word fit is you displaced your anger from one person to another. This is most commonly seen in power struggles where, as they showed here, right, the principal has more power than the teacher. Not really, but at least in America, not really. But the main concept is you're thinking of it like a boss and an employee, right? If you're a small employee of maybe a small company and a boss yells at the employee, you can't really fight back the boss. So now you're going to be mad about it, and you're going to go home and you're going to yell at your significant other or get mad at your kids about it, something like that. Okay? This is often seen as a sudden lashing out at someone unrelated to the initial upsetting act. Okay, so look out for that. That is displacement. They tell you to compare displacement to projection. So again, displacement was picking something up from here and moving it there, right? That's what the word really means. So you picked up your anger from one place and dropped it to another person, completely unrelated. Projection is like using a projector, right? You use a projector to project whatever's on the screen onto a wall or onto a curtain, something like that. So what is projection in psychology? So that's right here, right? Projection, attributing an unacceptable internal impulse to an external source. Okay? A man who wants to cheat on his wife accuses his wife of being a cheater, right? So he's projecting himself onto her, right? Just like a projector is supposed to do. A child angry with his parents' divorce decision falsely thinks his parents are angry with him. A less obvious example, but this was actually a question. Okay? So this child is very angry, right? And he's projecting his anger into his parents and saying now the parents are angry with him. Okay? So this is a very... It can become examples where, in questions it can look very vague. But the basic breakdown is you should somehow notice in projection that one person had a certain feeling towards another, and then by the end of the question stem, that same feeling is now being projected backwards from the other person, right? That's projection, okay? So in displacement, you took out one person's anger onto another. In projection, you had anger towards someone else. Now you're blaming them for being angry at you, okay? Both of these are immature ways of handling things. These are both unnecessary, silly things everyone does, especially in, like early relationships when you're dating and stuff. It's a very common thing that happens there too. And you want to make sure you really understand the difference between these two words, because these are two words of this list of ego defenses that definitely commonly pops up And anytime you have a question on either one, both of them will be there. Okay, so you really have to be careful, because now you're talking about two ego defenses that are both immature anyway. You just have to know the definition of each one to really be able to pick one over the other. Continuing on, the last thing on this page was dissociation. Temporary, drastic change in personality, memory, consciousness, or motor behavior to avoid emotional stress. Patient has incomplete or no memory of the traumatic event. Very, very common and sad thing, but still immature. A victim of sexual abuse suddenly appears numb and detached when she is exposed to her abuser. The reason this ego defense is immature is because it never really dealt with the traumatic event, right? You never came to finally accepting the traumatic event, that yes, this happened and I'm okay, let's get past this, right? Instead, you're kind of doing this thing where you're like, all right, let's just forget about it. But you're not really able to forget about it, right? You basically, at the same time, you're kind of dissociating that memory from yourself, as if it didn't happen to you, but it did, right? And again, this victim of sexual abuse, let's say it is a female, right? So this woman here is trying to imagine she never got sexual abuse because she doesn't want to accept that, right? It's a tough thing to accept. She doesn't want to accept that, and she never deals with those feelings. Now, when she's in front of her abuser, she just becomes a whole different person, right? Loses all control of herself in the sense that she can't really talk to you the natural, normal way I'm talking to you guys right now. Okay, very, very big thing, but again, very easy to catch in a question. Very easy to catch in a question. There's nothing to really compare this to. Next thing here, fixation. So these, what is this one? This is. Okay, this is the basic break. Okay, I'll come back to that. So ego defenses continued. Fixation. What is fixation? Fixation is where you have partially remaining at a more childish level of development. Right? So a surgeon throws a tantrum in the operating room because the last case ran very late. Everyone is a victim of fixation, either personally doing it or having seen it being done. Right? You do things that were childish and immature of you, and you're doing it because something really stressful happened or something stupid happened and you just don't know how to handle it like a mature adult, right? This surgeon was doing surgery, and it was only supposed to maybe take 2 hours, and it went on to like 3.5 hours for whatever reason. Now he's throwing a tantrum, right? That's silly. That's very immature. It looks bad, unnecessary. They want you to compare that to regression, which you could tell from the word regressing. It means that you're probably going back in time, right? And that's exactly what this is, regression. Involuntarily turning back the maturational clock to earlier modes of dealing with the world, right? Seen in children under stress such as illness, punishment, or birth of a new sibling. Right? Example, bedwetting in a previously toilet-trained child. Very common thing in kids, regression. Adults don't really tend to do regression, but children are going to be seen doing this. So a lot of times what happens, and this is most commonly seen in families that have multiple kids, one child might be like 10 and the other might be 7, and the 10-year-old should be acting like a 10-year-old, right? Much more mature than the 7-year-old. Now, oftentimes when you do something for the 7-year-old one, the 10-year-old one is going to act like a 7-year-old because he also wants you to do it for them. And this birth of a new sibling thing is a really big thing. Birth of a new sibling often makes many kids feel like they're going to lose out on love, lose out on care, lose out on support because of the new sibling that everyone's going to be giving their attention to, right? So that jealousy kicks in. And since this is basically about jealousy in these examples, it's immature, okay? Also in illness. Now in illness, even adults often tend to look like they're regressing, right? You might have a fully grown 40-year-old or 30-year-old man gets sick, and now he just doesn't want to go to work, wants someone to just bring him soup all the time, etc., etc. He's acting really immature. Unnecessarily. He should be able to handle himself just fine, but chooses not to. Right? So regression, involuntarily turning back the maturational clock, whereas fixation was partially remaining at a more childish level just because you're happy with it. You like acting that way. Right? This also involves any scenario where, this is basically any scenario where as a grown adult you dealt with something the same way you used to deal with it when you were a tiny kid. Okay, so what would be another example of this? Like a silly example would be like, oh, maybe you're like 27 now, you got into a fight and someone punched you. now you go to your mom and tell your mom, hey mom, this man hit me, right? That was going to your mom and telling your mom this man hit me was a thing you used to do when you were really little. Now that you're grown up, if someone hits you, you call the cops or you hit them back if you're strong enough to, or something like that. So be very careful in making sure you understand the difference between fixation versus regression as well. Next one, idealization. Okay, so idealization, expressing extremely positive thoughts of self and others while ignoring negative thoughts. So it's literally idealization, just like the word sounds like. It sounds like a process because it ends in ation. It's a process of making someone or something ideal, right? So you're ignoring the negative traits, the negative thoughts, negative whatever it might be. So a patient boasts about his physician and his accomplishments while ignoring any flaws. Okay, this is often seen in couples as well, where maybe a husband might say a million nice things about his wife while ignoring, many of the bad things about his wife that might really bother him. This is also seen in work environments, right, where someone might talk about their boss as the best person on earth because they're trying to suck up, while ignoring the fact that their boss is really not taking care of many issues that are around the office. Very common thing. Everyone's done it in one way or another, and really easy to remember the word. Identification. Now, we all know identification basically means to show your ID, show your driver's license, show something. Largely unconscious assumption of the characteristics, qualities, or traits of another person or group. Right? We've all done this. You see someone and you assume what they're like, even though you never even spoke to the person. A resident starts putting his stethoscope in his pocket like his favorite attending instead of wearing it around his neck like before. Now, what happens in identification is, remember I just said you're supposed to show your ID, right? But instead of showing your ID, you're kind of so assumption here is basically meaning like taking on. So you're assuming someone else's ID onto yourself, right? And that's kind of what identification is. So it's an ironic word in the sense that you're not really showing your own identification. You're showing someone else's identification on yourself, right? This is also often done between groups of friends, often in odd numbers of groups of friends, where what often happens is that, let's say in a circle of 3 friends, one friend always ends up being the friend that everyone makes fun of, right? It's just a very silly, immature, common thing. Eventually, you might let's say you're the person that gets made fun of. Eventually, you might make another circle of friends, and now you might assume the identification of one of the other 2 friends. So you're going to act like those other 2 friends who were always cooler or whatever, right? It's a very immature thing to do. You should be able to act like yourself and be mature yourself. Right? So identification is like imitation in a sense, or think of identification theft. Right? Identification is actually identification theft. You're becoming someone else. Okay? Intellectualization. So making something smart. Using facts and logic to emotionally distance oneself from a stressful situation. A patient diagnosed with cancer discusses the pathophysiology of the disease. Right? Something silly like that. Again, immature, you're kind of trying to dilute the actual issue here by talking about a bunch of other intelligent things just so you don't have to start thinking about what's wrong. Okay? Intellectualization, often seen in patients who might have had a huge business loss, right? Then they start talking about, oh, well, I bought $3,000 worth of stocks and they all went down, but the way it looks like from previous, graphs of the same stocks, it looks like it's going to go up again in another year, blah, blah. They start coming up with all these facts, and you'll see that in the question. You'll see it in the question. They're going to be speaking a lot of extra gibberish, but very intelligent and correct, usually factual gibberish, irrelevant to the fact that you have cancer, right? He's diagnosed with cancer. Like, it doesn't matter what the pathophysiology is, and it's great that you know what it is, you still have cancer, right? So that's just an immature way of handling with the stressor. Isolation. This is actually isolation of affect, so emotion. Separating feelings from ideas and events. Describing murder in graphic detail with no emotional response. Same goes with describing your own rape case, describing anything really emotionally powerful without displaying emotion. Right? So that's isolation of affect. It's kind of like flattened affect. This usually is seen in patients who went through some kind of really bad trauma, or seen in patients who have been stressed so much that they've kind of lost, sense of how to even react to something now. Like they just don't have emotions anymore. Pretty much given up, right? Depression is another sense where you can see isolation of affect. So this one is also pretty easy to remember, not something you'll get confused about in the question. Remember, this list, when you study this list of words, you're going to tell yourself you got it and you understood it and you are good to go. Then you do a question and then you are no longer able to pick the right word, right? So don't try to convince yourself that you know it. Really focus on the words that you are not going to know on your test, like displacement, dissociation, projection, right? Intellectualization, and regression. Now, reaction formation and repression are also two more that are, you might think you know it, and then you do a question you might forget. So we'll come to those. Right here, passive aggression. We all see this every day in the work environment, every single day. Even in relationships, we see this with our family, demonstrating hostile feelings in a non-confrontational manner, showing indirect opposition. Right? So an angry employee is repeatedly late to work, but won't admit it is a way to get back at the manager. Right? Passive aggressive ways of dealing with things happen all the time. A group of people living in the same house because they're all medical students. Like this is a real example right here actually. So I was living with 3 other medical students when I was in Atlanta for rotations, and 2 of them really didn't like each other. You could see it in the way they kind of acted with each other. So their issue with each other was lack of cleanliness. So one of them would really not like washing dishes at all and would do it at nighttime. The other one wanted people to wash dishes as soon as you were done eating. Like, why are you stacking up plates? Because it's causing bugs and rats and shit like that. So now the passive aggressive thing they would do with each other is that the one that didn't like washing dishes would continue to not wash dishes and would make up excuses like, hey man, I got a lot to study for tonight. I'll take care of that as soon as I'm done. And then he would just walk away not having washed his dishes, which would have really just taken a minute anyway, and then you could go study. Right, so passive aggressive stuff happens all the time. We all do it. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we were able to get our revenge or whatever. And revenge is immature also, right? So that's how you remember the fact that this is not a mature ego response, and it's kind of silly. It's kind of silly, but very common thing, very entertaining thing too. We talked about projection. Now, rationalization. This is a word that makes the word intellectualization pretty difficult to remember, right? Right now, we talked about intellectualization. We understood it. We told ourselves we got this. Now, when we see it on a test, we'll know. But then you do a test question and you see both words, intellectualization and rationalization, and you might actually get confused. A very common thing. And the reason it happens is because you're not used to these words, right? You don't use them every day. You don't read them every day. Rationalization is asserting plausible explanations for events that actually occurred for other reasons, usually to avoid self-blame. We've all done this as a kid, right? And here they talk about a mature person doing it. After getting fired, claiming that the job was not important anyway. When we were kids, we would do silly things and then we would rationalize why we did it, right? But it was wrong. We knew it was wrong. We were just trying to make it look like it was something okay to do and get away with it. But our parents were always smarter than us and knew we were just rationalizing. Okay? So rationalization is kind of like explanation. You're explaining something using rational or things that you think that are rational sentences. Whereas intellectualization is using intellect. You're talking about something in terms of intelligent data, intelligent understanding, while disregarding the fact that it's still a fact. Just because you know all about it doesn't mean that you're no longer affected by it. Okay? Rationalization is rational. You're trying to make something look like it was okay by using supporting sentences that are supposed to make it sound like, oh yeah, it makes sense now, I get it, you're good to go, man. You're not good to go. This is an immature ego response. This guy got fired and now he's pretty fucked. He needs a new job. Okay? Reaction formation. Reaction formation, replacing a warded off idea or feeling with an unconsciously derived emphasis on its opposite. Okay? And this one is an immature ego response, whereas sublimation is a mature one. So this difference is pretty easy to understand, and we're going to see that. So reaction formation, a patient with lustful sexual thoughts enters a monastery. Okay? So reaction formation, A woman who had an unhappy childhood does not want kids and resents having to manage her husband's son. Instead of hating the child, she shows excessive care and plans an exciting birthday party for the child. So the way I memorized it was I used this topic right here, because both of those words were physics related, reaction, sublimation. So reaction formation, in physics, Newton's third law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So in reaction formation, you do the opposite thing, right? You're having sexual thoughts, so you go to church. You hate the kid, so you do something really nice for the kid. Something like that, right? Opposite reaction. That's what reaction formation is. You do the opposite of how you truly feel. In sublimation, you replace an unacceptable wish with a course of action that is similar to the wish, but socially acceptable. This is a very mature thing we all do. A teenager's aggression toward his parents, because of their high expectations, is channeled into excelling in sports. Right? And this is pretty much all of us, right? All of our parents have these high expectations, or many of our parents have these high expectations of making us become a very successful doctor. So we channel that aggression we have towards our parents, if we have aggression towards our parents, to not go angry and yell at our parents, but instead go do something productive with that anger and put it into good use. Okay, so this is a mature ego defense. This is acceptable. This is okay, right? And everything is positive. Nothing bad happened here, like in this example. Here is the physics memorization method. So I wrote sublimation in physics. This is the phase change from gas to liquid, but the molecules are still the same, right? So sublimation is gas to liquid, which is a rare thing. Gas to liquid, but the gas and the liquid were both water, so the water didn't change, right? So basically here, the person is still angry, but using it appropriately. Instead of using it in that phase, you're using it in a different phase. So instead of here showing anger to the parents that you're angry at, you go and excel in sports, and you use your anger to drive yourself in doing well in that sport, okay? But the reaction formation example works a lot better. So opposite, equal and opposite reaction, so always doing the opposite. Whereas here, you're doing the same thing. You're not doing the opposite. You're angry. You're still showing anger, but you're not showing it to the person who you're actually channeling it towards, because that would be immature. So instead of that, you go and do it in the right way. And then last two for immature, repression. So repression is always to, try to forget something, put it away. Involuntarily withholding an idea or feeling from conscious awareness, right? So a 20-year-old does not remember going to counseling during his parents' divorce 10 years earlier, right? Now, repression is one you might not have actually seen in everyday life, but that's because whoever did the repression actually forgot or doesn't know they've done the repression, right? So no one talks about it. Just like this 20-year-old. This 20-year-old won't come tell you, oh yeah, my parents used to go to court all the time, but I don't remember. Okay, so they just don't remember. It's been repressed. It's not even being spoken about. So you might not have actually seen it with anyone. This is very different from everything else we've seen so far, so it's very easy to remember. However, they want you to compare it with suppression, and suppression is a mature ego response. So the difference between the two is very big. When you look at suppression, this is intentionally withholding an idea or feeling from conscious awareness, only temporarily. Right? Choosing to not worry about the big game until it is time to play. Just like all of us after our step one. After our step one, we suppress the fact that we just took step one. We don't talk about it. We don't go around posting about it. We forget this test even exists until the day you get your score. Right? And until then, you're not going to sit there and stress about it, cry about it, pray every fucking day. Well, you might pray every day, but you might not, keep checking every single second. No, you're going to wait until you finally get that email telling you your score has been posted, right? So suppression, very mature thing, nothing wrong here. There's nothing to be ashamed of doing suppression. But in repression, this is immature. This was a way this 20-year-old's young mind, when he was younger, decided to deal with the issue that was very stressful, right? He never accepted it. He didn't accept the fact that his parents are getting divorced. Instead, he just decided to forget the fact that he went to divorce court so many times with his parents. Right? It's just not stuck in his mind. He didn't actively do it, though. Involuntarily. He didn't actively do it. He was young. His brain decided to do it. Right? Whereas here, suppression is intentional. We finish step one, and we intentionally choose to not worry about the test anymore after we're done and just wait until the score gets posted. Last immature one, splitting. So splitting is something that's going to come up again over and over in psychiatry. Believing that people are either all good or all bad at different times due to intolerance or intolerance of ambiguity, right? So these are people that don't like ambiguity. They don't like saying something like, oh yeah, he's okay, but sometimes he does this, but sometimes he's cool, but sometimes he's really annoying, etc. This is commonly seen in borderline personality disorder. And you can always remember that. A border splits two countries. Okay, a border splits two countries. So borderline personality disorder will present with splitting. Borderline personality disorder is one of your cluster B personality traits. A patient says that all the nurses are cold and insensitive, but the doctors are warm and friendly. Okay, that's splitting, making everyone of one group look great and everyone of another group look bad. Okay, so that kind of characteristic thing. That excuse me. That wraps up your immature ego defenses. The only mature ones left to talk about are your altruism and humor. So altruism is alleviating negative feelings via unsolicited generosity, which provides gratification. Okay, and you're supposed to compare this to reaction formation. Remember reaction formation where you did the opposite, right? Reaction formation, again, they tell you to compare it to sublimation, but sublimation and altruism both compare to reaction formation. So very important to understand that. Reaction formation, you took some kind of thing that was pissing you off and you did the opposite. You made a happy thought. Here in altruism, you're pissed off about something, so you do something great for yourself, not with someone else. Right? A mafia boss makes a large donation charity. He's a mafia boss. He does bad things. He deals drugs, he sells drugs, stuff like that. To make himself feel good about himself and convince to himself that he's a good person, he donates to a charity, which is a good deed. Right? So altruism is kind of like balancing out your deeds. Okay? And this is considered a mature defense because nothing bad is happening. If anything, you're doing good things. You're doing good things to make up for the bad things you do. Right now, it's not necessarily, logical or effective, but it is a mature defense. Okay, so the way I memorized it was I wrote here, very similar to the immature reaction formation, but in reaction formation, the good deed is not planned or consciously acted out. Both people are doing a good deed to wash the bad deed away. Okay, so I always used to think about this as, right here, alternative truth. Right? Altruism. There is an alternative truth to the character of this person. In the example, he is the boss of a murderous mafia, but presents himself as a philanthropist. Right? So again, there's that opposite thing happening, just like in reaction formation. Mafia boss versus philanthropist are opposites of each other, but it's the same person doing it, and he's doing it because he wants to kind of balance out his identity and his self-identity. In reaction formation, right, you do an immature thing. You're not accepting the fact that you actually hate the kid. The mature thing to do for this woman, for example, would be to probably talk to the husband and maybe even end up getting a divorce or something. Because it's kind of silly that she's living with a man and she never wanted kids. Why even marry a man who has a child then? Something weird like that, right? So there isn't much. The line between altruism and reaction formation is not that clear. So be careful in seeing the sentence or question stem you get. To me, the biggest difference in all the examples I had here was the fact that this woman, right, she's doing good and bad for someone else, right? So, for example, this woman had a bad feeling towards the kid, so she ended up doing something good for the kid. In altruism, you do it for yourself. It provides self-gratification. Not just gratification, it's self-gratification, or provides gratification to you. So in altruism, you are the bad person, and you go do something good to make yourself believe you're the good person. Okay, that's the big line, the big difference between reaction formation and altruism. Last thing, humor, right? Lightheartedly expressing uncomfortable feelings to shift the internal focus away from the distress. A nervous medical student jokes about the boards. They thought it was a funny one to have it here, but this is actually pretty serious. So even the person who wrote this is displaying humor, right? This is actually pretty serious. Like, if they think these boards are a joke for us, it's not. But you see how they put this here? So this kind of example in itself is a example of humor. Okay, not the hardest thing to see in a question. So it's not really that high yield either. They don't like asking questions about ones that are very easy and obvious. They like asking questions about the ones in this page where this says versus something else, right? There's comparison between other words. Make sure you know exactly what the word means. Do not leave space for there to be a blurring of definitions in your mind, such that when you sit down and look at a question and then you look at the answer choices, you get confused. Oftentimes, if you do get a question where you have to, identify an ego defense, try to identify it before looking at the answer choices, because you will get confused. Okay, so if you read a question, maybe someone was mad about something, and they went and got mad at someone else about it. That's displacement, right? You're displacing your anger from one place to another, and then look at your answer choices, and you should see displacement there. You pick it, you move on, something like that. The other thing you want to be able to do is something I always talk about: defining each one of these without looking at the definition, without looking at the book. This is how you used to memorize vocabulary words back in elementary school. So you should use the same mechanism. Write these words out and then define them without looking at the description in the book. And even go as far as giving a new example, brand new example that you tailored yourself, not something that you read in the book or heard somewhere else. Tailor an example for each one. Spend a couple, it doesn't take more than an hour to really master all these ego defenses, and then you move on. Okay. Now, this image here was about something weird that isn't really necessarily spoken about in the book. So the graph here shows you ID or id, superego, ego defenses, and then the conscious ego. Okay. And the concept in this graph is that everything kind of comes together to decide the action you're going to take. Okay. So I wrote here, ego defenses do a great job in suppressing some completely unacceptable id impulses and other unreal unconscious ideas. Okay? And then the one they put here, so id might be like, go have sex with your mom. So the superego is going to say, gross, that's not acceptable. And your unconscious ego is where all these thoughts are kind of happening. Okay? Your ego defenses kind of separate that from your conscious ego, and then now you go ahead and correctly handle out what is an acceptable right thing to do. Okay, so this example was from USMLE RX. They went to the extreme with it because they really wanted you to be able to identify with it and keep it to your mind. Keep it to your mind strongly. The last thing I wrote here was this word externalization. Right, this is a word that's missing in this list of words, externalization. This is an immature defense mechanism in which an individual projects internal characteristics onto the external world. Okay, this is not given in first aid. Maybe they'll add it in 2020, but I did see it as an answer choice. It wasn't the correct answer choice, but it was an answer choice in a question I did. Alright, so externalization. Immature ego defense in which individuals project internal characteristics like moods or attitudes onto the external world. Alright. So that's it for that. In the next video, we'll continue on into psych pathology. All right, thanks a lot for joining. Catch you guys later.